Andrew Johnson enters the presidency like a man pushing against a door he insists is stuck because of bad carpentry, when in truth, the frame has shifted with the building. He is not a creature of salons or law schools. He is a tailor from Raleigh, apprenticed at 10, runaway at 16, a self-taught reader who learned syllables from a wife who had more book in her fingers than in her family's purse. Eliza McCardle placed a primer and a grammar on the table the way other brides lay out a dowry. The young husband bent over vowels and consonants at night, and a life began to take a different shape. In Greeneville, Tennessee, he pieced coats by day and pieced arguments by evening, slipping from workbench to stump with a craftsman's confidence that if you know how to measure, you can make things fit. He entered town government, then the statehouse, then Congress, bringing with him a certainty that democracy must be a ladder wide enough for men who begin with nothing. He distrusted bankers, monopolies, and aristocracies with the fury of a poor boy who had watched well-dressed men pass laws like mirrors. He championed the homesteader and the mechanic, despised the planter's condescension, and cultivated a Jacksonian stubbornness that placed the plain people in his mouth like a vow. This trajectory made him an oddity by 1861, a Southern Democrat who would not walk out when secession began to pass through legislatures like fever. As a United States Senator from Tennessee, he stood alone from his section, denouncing the ritual of departure with a tailor's contempt for men who take shears to national fabric without knowing how to stitch it back. He called secession a betrayal of poor whites and a vanity of grandees. He praised the Union with a workingman's piety. He became the figure Northern newspapers used to remind the country that principle can survive geography. When Union troops reclaimed Nashville, Lincoln made him military governor of Tennessee, a post that required every ounce of his rough energy and every trick of his courthouse experience. He suspended newspapers that served rebellion like tea. He demanded oaths. He promised mercy to those who would sign and severity to those who would not. The war, brute and vast, gave him an audience larger than any he had known. The logic he had carried since youth, government for the many, suspicion of the few who owned much, combined with a wartime taste for order. The effect was a man who knew how to swing a hammer and had begun to believe that nails could teach a people. Lincoln, needing to broaden a coalition, placed Johnson on the 1864 National Union ticket, and the soldier vote carried a tailor into the vice presidency. The oath found him sick with fever and strong drink, a moment that would be recalled with malice by enemies and embarrassment by friends. And then the month of April opened its trapdoor. Booth's pistol tore the book in half. The tall lawyer, who had made sentences do the work of armies, lay dying in a boarding house across the street from a theater. And at 10 in the morning, a man born without advantage stepped into a room where advantage would be the only furniture for years. He had promised to be Lincoln's arm in the South. Now he would be his own mind in the nation. He brought to the chair the mixture that had made him distinct, a class rage sharpened into populism, a reverence for the Union structured like a religion, and a granite resistance to any doctrine that smelled like aristocracy, even fatally, when that doctrine was the simple proposition that Black Americans, made free by war and law, must be made citizens by statute and protection. Johnson believed the Republic had been broken by planters who dragged common men into treason to save their cotton thrones. He wanted those grandees humbled. He also believed, with equal heat, that the federal government should not sit in every parlor and dictate every hour, that states once in rebellion could be readmitted by an oath and an amended constitution, that a president could restore by proclamation what secession had shattered by ordinance. And he believed this was the hinge on which the next 4 years would swing, that the question of Black political rights belonged to states and to time and to a providence he declined to name, rather than to Congress armed with national power. He began quickly, with the decisiveness of a foreman. In May and then throughout the summer of 1865, he issued amnesty proclamations that offered wide pardons to former Confederates upon oath, except for certain classes, the officers and the men of wealth, who must apply directly to him for mercy. He intended this exception as a Democrat's whip. The haughty would come, hat in hand, to a tailor's desk. Come they did, governors, generals, magnates, standing in a hallway like petitioners at a county office. He signed papers with the satisfaction of a man who thought he had turned hierarchy on its head. He appointed provisional governors across the South, instructed them to summon conventions, repeal secession, repudiate Confederate debt, and ratify the 13th Amendment. He expected that these steps, measured and neat, would bring states back into their old places, chastened but intact. What came instead was the improvisation of defeat. Across Mississippi, South Carolina, Florida, and beyond, legislatures newly seated by his procedure wrote black codes that read like a translation of bondage into municipal law. Vagrancy statutes threatened to hire out the unemployed. Labor contracts imposed by courts resembled labor demanded by whips. Apprenticeships swallowed children. Weapons ordinances disarmed the recently freed in towns where old masters still held the sheriff's star. The Freedmen's Bureau, born at the end of the war to mediate labor, education, and relief, pushed against these devices with limited staff and a patience tested daily. Bureau courts tried to keep promises alive that battlefield proclamations had made. Johnson, who had accepted emancipation as a settled fact and insisted, rightly, that slavery was a planter's crime against the poor white as well as the enslaved black, refused to see in the codes an assault on the very union he claimed to worship. He told himself, and anyone who asked, that local self-government must be respected, that abuses would be corrected by neighbors, that federal intrusion would betray constitutional architecture. It was as if a man who had spent his life learning to trust his own hands could not credit testimony that a room was on fire unless he had struck the match. Congress returned in December 1865 with its own eyes full of smoke. The men who had led the war to its conclusion and the men who had learned politics on battlefields, Stevens and Sumner, and a cohort of Republicans who had discovered that emancipation without citizenship is a change of vocabulary, not a change of life, found themselves facing a president who intended to seat Southern delegations chosen under regimes that had excluded black voters and included unrepentant Confederate notables in their slates. Congress refused to admit them. Johnson called their refusal a usurpation. He vetoed a bill to enlarge the Freedmen's Bureau, complaining of bureaucratic empire and federal overreach. Congress revised and repassed it. He vetoed again. The House and Senate overrode him. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, insisting that national citizenship and equal civil rights declared by statute would rupture the balance of government. The Republicans assembled the two-thirds required and wrote the first great override into the president's record. He opposed the 14th Amendment when it was sent to the states, an amendment that made birthright citizenship explicit, equal protection a national promise, and the penalties for denying black male suffrage a matter of arithmetic in House seats. He urged Southern states to reject it. Many did. His message to the nation was a lecture in federalism delivered while citizens who had been held as property were being read their rights by soldiers. He did not merely write messages, he went on tour. The swing around the circle. In 1866 was meant to be an argument at scale, a presidential defense of his plan before midterm elections decided whether Congress would belong to those who trusted the executive's leniency or to those who had concluded that Reconstruction without transformation would be a mausoleum furnished like a parlor. Johnson, unused to the choreographies of national stump speech, brought a courthouse temper onto a railroad platform. He heckled hecklers. He compared himself to Christ and his foes to betrayers. He alleged conspiracy where he might have alleged error. Crowds turned unruly. Papers unfriendly to him wrote satire with ink still wet from riots in Memphis and New Orleans. where black people marching for rights met police and mobs whose uniforms were difficult to distinguish. In October, the elections made a verdict that even his allies recognized. The Republican majorities multiplied into supermajorities. The president had proved persuasive only to those already persuaded. From that winter forward, the machinery of Reconstruction was largely set by statute over his vetoes. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 placed the former Confederate states under military districts and required new constitutions drafted by conventions in which black men could vote, and white men who had broken their oath to the Union could not, unless Congress restored them. These laws sought to lay a ground in which citizenship could germinate without being plucked by a sheriff's hand. Johnson denounced the acts as revolutionary. He executed them grudgingly because he did not believe in refusing to execute law, even when he thought it poisonous. But he placed in field commands and in the War Department men whose diligence matched his reluctance. And where his choices failed him, where generals proved more radical than their titles, he reached for a lever closer at hand. The lever was Edwin M. Stanton. Stanton had been Lincoln's Iron Secretary of War, a man who managed telegraph lines like veins, who recruited, supplied, promoted, and punished with a ferocity that read as devotion to the flag. He had no love for Johnson's leniencies or for Johnson's temper. Johnson had no love for Stanton's sense that he embodied congressional purpose as well as executive policy. Between them lay an argument about the nature of the presidency that Congress decided to enter with a statute, the Tenure of Office Act, requiring the Senate's consent to remove certain appointed officials. Johnson believed the law unconstitutional, an amputating knife held by the legislature at the executive's shoulder. He waited for his moment. In August 1867, while the Senate was out, he suspended Stanton and asked Ulysses S. Grant to serve ad interim. Grant accepted and administered faithfully. When the Senate returned and refused to concur in Stanton's suspension, Grant stepped away and returned the office to Stanton, not wishing to be a party to a test case that might smudge his own prospects. Johnson, furious, named Lorenzo Tanis to the post and ordered him to take possession. Stanton barred his doors, locked his cabinets, slept on a sofa beneath portraits of the dead, and dared the president to send marshals. The crisis had the unseemly humor of farce and the heavy consequence of a constitutional trial. The House, ready with articles after 2 years of battle, voted impeachment. The trial in the Senate became the country's most ornate rehearsal in the theater of doubt. Managers presented Johnson as a man who had betrayed the Union's victory by coddling traitors, insulted the dead by sneering at their cause, violated a law to chase one man out of one office, and in doing so, threatened to crack the balance of government that had held since the century's birth. Johnson's counsel replied that the Tenure Act did not bind him in Stanton's case, that the president must be free to choose his own instruments. That Reconstruction by statute had already stretched the Constitution, and that to reduce the presidency to tenure at Congress's pleasure would make future executives the House's clerks. In far galleries sat lobbyists and diarists, saints and opportunists, watching a handful of Republican senators count the cost of removing a president not for theft or murder, but for stubbornness and constitutional theater. Edmund G. Ross of Kansas would be remembered for a vote cast like a coin into a storm, not guilty. 35 senators voted to convict, 19 to acquit, 1 vote short of the 2/3 required. Johnson survived by a margin that made survival a synonym for impotence. He finished his term lighter by illusions and heavier by enemies. He issued a Christmas amnesty in 1868 that pardoned remaining ex-Confederates. He signed routine appropriations. He watched Ulysses Grant, the soldier who had refused to be his prop, become the instrument of a Reconstruction built on laws Johnson had tried to stop. To freeze him in the posture of combat is to miss the other, quieter portion of his record, the work done by a nation that, even while tearing itself by statute and speech, continued to move outward and to knot threads that would matter for generations. William H. Seward. His Secretary of State and one of the most talented political craftsmen of the age bought Alaska from a desperate Russia in 1867, paying in gold for a geography that editors mocked as an icebox, and later Americans learned to call a continent's roof. He secured a coaling outpost at Midway and pressed the French emperor to withdraw troops from Mexico, where an Austrian, styled emperor under bayonets, discovered that the Monroe Doctrine still had teeth. The Archduke's fate at a Mexican wall proved that Europe's costume dramas would no longer be staged on American soil. He negotiated through Anson-Burlingame, a treaty with China that recognized migration as a mutual good and promised a degree of civil respect for Chinese nationals in the United States that the public would not keep. But the paper at least reminded the future that pledges are the first stage of decency. He failed because the Senate stopped him to acquire the Danish West Indies and to bind the British to a method for resolving the Alabama claims, which would be settled in another administration. But the fact of these efforts meant that a presidency at war with Congress on domestic life was still, abroad, capable of coherence. On the plains and in the mountain corridors, the Republic's march resumed with the mixture that would define the next half-century. Rail surveys drawn like promises across land not empty, treaties negotiated to move nations from paths to reservations. Wars triggered when promises were broken by hunger, fear, and greed. The Fetterman catastrophe near Fort Phil Kearny in 1866, where soldiers were pulled over a ridge by decoy and destroyed by a people defending a road, taught the War Department and the newspapers that not every skirmish would be a footnote. The treaties at Medicine Lodge and Fort Laramie, signed in 1867 and 1868, reflected both the government's desire for lines it could draw and the reality that ink cannot feed a child or imprison the buffalo wind. Johnson did not design an Indian policy suited to mercy. He presided over the continuation of a pattern older than his oath and deadlier than any single man's decision. Yet it mattered that the executive branch, distracted by combat in Washington, lacked the attention span to restrain the worst impulses of surveyor and speculator. When a presidency is a fight, the unloud victims are those who lose first. The core of him remains the collision between two beliefs, that the Union is sacred and that the state is sovereign, that emancipation is done and that equality must wait. He could not see that to say wait to men just delivered from chains is to invite 1,000 hands to refasten the shackles with laws and ropes. He could not see that citizenship is not an aristocratic privilege, but a public safety measure. He could not imagine a federal government acting as the guarantor of the humblest person's contract and safety, without thereby becoming, for him, the very monster he had spent his life resisting. He mocked aristocracy, by which he meant the planters and their northern bankrollers. He refused to admit that prejudice can be a kind of aristocracy, a presumption of natural right to rule, that requires national power to break it. He spoke with eloquence about the masses, but he narrowed the definition of the word until it excluded the very masses whose labor had been stolen for generations. He is often painted as a villain in a single color, drunk, prude, racist, an accidental heir who then tried to disinherit the nation from its victory. The paint is not entirely unjust. It is also a flattening of a figure whose life complicates the comfort of simple condemnation. He loathed secession before most Northern politicians learned how to pronounce the word with hatred. He risked his life in Nashville, faced conspirators and mobs, and kept a Union foothold against a Confederacy that would have gladly hanged him. He believed genuinely in a republic of small property and equal laws for white men. The sentence breaks where his imagination did. In the speeches that made him beloved to poor whites, he pictured the day laborer as a citizen and the ex-slave as a question. He entertained, in a few moments when political arithmetic demanded it, the idea of limited suffrage for intelligent and veteran black men. He never placed that idea at the center of his program. He called those who demanded full equality fanatics, and he treated the murder of freed people in the streets of southern cities as if they were regrettable accidents in municipal housekeeping, rather than the visible shade of counter-revolution. He never built a story that could transform his admirable hatred of oligarchy into a protection for those long excluded from the word people. What would Reconstruction have been had he chosen differently? The question tempts the counterfactual and forces a return to the practical. Congress, with or without him, had the votes to pass civil rights and military supervision. The Army, with or without him, had the officers to enforce. But the presidency, given to a conciliator with imagination, could have supplied the country with a language that sanctified equality as a continuation of union, rather than as a punishment of rebels. He could have visited Charleston and New Orleans to say aloud, as only a president can, that the citizen wearing blue or black skin would be protected by sheriffs and judges, that the federal flag on a post meant safety on the road home from work, that ballots would not be theories but paper in hands, and that the old rich and the newly free stood before a law neither side owned. He could have opposed Congress on process while endorsing it on destination. He could have spared the future some of its bitterness by making the first years of freedom feel like a blessing instead of a dare. Instead, he made himself the spokesman of delay and the champion of state rights precisely when those rights were being used to recreate the subordination war had overturned. His character, admirably resistant to flattery, magnificently immune to intimidation, married itself to a theory of the Constitution that could not protect a child from a constable. After his acquittal, the room emptied. He issued his amnesty, signed routine papers, refused to attend Grant's inauguration with the stubbornness of a man who will not pretend friendship he does not feel, and went home to Tennessee. The state, which had watched him become a national figure with mingled pride and fatigue, received him with as much warmth as any place can offer a man who is at once a symbol and a neighbor. He ran and failed for the Senate, ran and failed for the House, ran and failed again, and then, in 1875, secured the one triumph that allowed him to complete a Democratic circle. He returned to the United States Senate, the only former president to do so, and stood to speak as an elected tribune of the place that had made him. He would not serve long. He died that summer, at 66, in a chair at his daughter's home in East Tennessee, asking for the Constitution, placing a book beneath his head like a pillow, as if the pages could make the departure gentler. The ledger of his presidency is stubborn. On one side, the assertion of executive independence, the refusal to let Congress turn removal power into a leash, the insistence that Reconstruction required restraint as well as zeal. The foreign policy steadied by Seward's craft, the avoidance of a war with a European empire merely to appease adventurers, the continuation of the national households. Work while the national family fought at the dinner table. On the other, a blindness to the urgency of black safety and black citizenship, a contempt for congressional authority that shaded into contempt for the nation's most generous moral voices, a touring season that made the presidency sound like a heckler's booth, a willingness to interpret riot as politics rather than as terror, a catalog of vetoes that taught the Republic how to use two-thirds without teaching it how to heal. He was not the worst man who could have held the office in 1865. He may have been the worst match for the problem the office faced. Reconstruction required the capacity to imagine strangers as neighbors and neighbors as equals. Johnson could imagine enemies as neighbors and neighbors as enemies. He could not cross the last bridge. And yet there is a rough integrity that ought to be acknowledged even as the verdict remains hard. He believed that a president should not lie about his convictions. He refused to make a show of conversion for the sake of harmony. He thought hypocrisy the aristocrat's vice. He preferred defeat to masquerade. That choice, tragic and admirable in a biography, becomes, in a presidency, a failure to serve the nation rather than himself. The job does not always reward men who are pure in their unpersuadability. The job often requires persuadability toward a larger justice. Johnson's tailor faith, measure twice, cut once, trust the pattern, could not accommodate a society in which the pattern itself had been a whip. He tried to mend the garment by restitching seams. The cloth required a new cut. His enemies remembered him as a stone in the road. His friends remembered him as the last honest Jacksonian in a city of counterfeiters. The generations that followed turned him into a lesson. The lesson is not that the poor should not rise, or that self-education breeds arrogance, or that strong presidents are dangerous. The lesson is particular and permanent, that a republic at the moment of widening its promise needs leaders who will make new citizens feel the state behind them. That neutrality in the face of organized injustice is not neutrality. That states' rights, a phrase with constitutional dignity, can be used as a fence to pen people who have just walked out of a prison. That Congress, when acting to rescue rights, is not the enemy of liberty, but its custodian. That the presidency, when sustained by stubbornness alone, becomes a barricade rather than a bridge. Andrew Johnson's life remains a narrative Americans tell themselves when they want to remember that their institutions are open to talent and endurance. A boy flees an apprenticeship, learns his letters at his wife's side, becomes mayor, legislator, governor, senator, war governor, vice president, president. If the story closed there, the music would swell. But the story's second half is written in dissonance, because the highest office found in him both the virtues and the limits of his class faith. He was a tribune of white workingmen precisely when the nation needed a tribune of workingmen without adjective. He was a constitutional conservative precisely when the Constitution needed to be read for its capacity to grow. He was a healer by restoration precisely when the body required surgery. He was brave in one direction, immovable in another, and history is a patient ledger that records both. The oaths he kept to union and the vows he broke to equality, the men he humbled and the families he refused to see, the statutes he opposed that became instruments of hope, and the principles he defended that would be invoked, years later, to restrain a Congress that had learned too well how to rule by momentary zeal. It is customary to close with a small scene that tries to capture the person. Choose this one. The tailor's bench still sits in the Johnson home in Greeneville, scarred by needles and chalk. A plank where a young man leaned over cloth and imagined how a jacket should look on a man who would pay at the end of the month. The bench is low. The window above it looks out on a street built by hands. On a late afternoon, before his politics discovered Washington's angles, he folds a finished garment, smooths a lapel, and studies a seam with satisfaction. He believes in scenes. He believes that if the pieces are cut right and the thread is good, the jacket will endure weather and wear. Years later, in a house painted white and freighted with grief, he tries to do the same with states and citizens, measuring, pinning, insisting on a pattern that had fit before the war. But the bodies have changed. The cloth is a different weight. The seam that once lay flat now puckers and tears because the old cut cannot accommodate a new chest. He blames the cloth. The century blames the tailor. Somewhere between those blames is the truth. He was not cruel by design. He was not kind enough by imagination. He did not betray the Union to its enemies. He betrayed, without knowing how to stop, the promise that the Union's victory might become a life equipped for all of its children. He will never be beloved by those who think justice is the first purpose of a government. He will always be defended by those who think order must come first. Between those sentences, the United States still lives, still argues, still votes. His name remains on the list of presidents and on the longer roll of men who proved that talent can carry a human being from a workshop to a capital. And that character, its size and its blinders, decides what the journey will give to others. He was, in the end, a caution without malice, a rebuke to the comforting idea that grit alone can make a statesman, and a reminder that the Union is not merely a form to be restored, but a promise to be enlarged. He held the form and would not let go. Others pried his fingers away and tried to lift the promise higher, while the nation, bruised and unsure, learned painfully the difference.
Midnight rails under silver moon, Dusty boots on a winding road. A shadow's the only friend I've known since she packed up and let me go. Empty whiskey bottle on the seat. Her laugh still echoes in my bones. The saddle's heavy with memories. I ride alone where the wind still blows. Nowhere else to be. 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 Sunrise paints the horizon gold, but it don't warm a lonesome soul. Every town I pass feels half her size. Every trail's haunted by goodbye. I whisper prayers to open skies, hoping someday my heart'll find a brand new path beyond the pain, where broken hearts can heal in time. Nowhere else to be. 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 Nowhere else to be.